document was finished. A cry for blood of the Evermond family. "See if you can save him now, my doctor," Madame Defarge muttered. The verdict was simple and terrible to hear. The Marquis de Evermond, known as Charles Darnay, was sentenced to die on the guillotine the next day. Sidney Carton went straight from the court to the wine shop in St. Antoine. There he bought a drink and raised his glass to the French Republic. Madame Defarge glared at him. "He looks like Evermond," she muttered to the men around her. Then she turned to her husband. "You'd rescue him from prison if you could, wouldn't you?" she asked. "No, I wouldn't," her husband protested. "But I wouldn't seek to exterminate his entire family." "Listen," Madame Defarge whispered to the men. "Listen to the secret I told my husband when he came home from the Bastille with that letter. That dying boy in the stables was my brother. That dying girl was my sister. I was the sister he sent away to safety." "It is so," Defarge said. "Then don't tell me to stop," his wife spat. Chapter 10. Number 23. When Carton returned to Mr. Lorry's rooms, he found him pacing up and down as he waited for Dr. Manette. And when the doctor came through the door at midnight, his face told them there was no hope. "Where is my bench?" he asked. "I must finish those shoes." "The last chance is gone," Carton said. He took some papers from his pocket. "Keep these safe, sir. Here is my pass to leave Paris tomorrow, and Dr. Manette's. It will allow him to leave with Lucy and the child." "Are they in danger?" Mr. Lorry asked. "Yes, great danger," Carton replied. "You remember that I have one last visit to Darnay? Everything depends on you, Mr. Lorry. You must leave at 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, as soon as I return to the carriage. Do as I say, or we shall all die." "I shall play my part faithfully," Mr. Lorry said. "And I hope to do mine," Carton replied. Charles Darnay, alone in his cell, knew that nobody could save him now. When he had written his farewell letters, he lay down on his straw bed. "I am done with this world now," he thought. The next morning he paced up and down until he heard footsteps in the passage and a key turning in the lock. It was Sidney Carton. "Are you a prisoner here?" Darnay asked him. "No," Carton replied. "I have no time to explain. Now take off your boots and put on mine. Quickly!" "Carton, there is no escape from this place," Darnay said. "You will only die with me." "I am not asking you to escape with me," he replied. "Put on my cloak and take that ribbon from your hair." Darnay did as Carton commanded. "What is that strange smell?" he asked. As he spoke, his eyes closed and he slipped to the floor. Carton sent for the guards at once. "Sidney Carton is overcome with grief. Take him out to his carriage," he ordered. The door closed and Carton was left alone. Nobody raised the alarm and he breathed more freely as he waited. As soon as the clock struck 2, his door opened and a gaoler said, "Follow me, Evermond." The same shadows falling on the prison were also falling on a carriage slowing down at the gates of Paris. The guards inspected the passes of its occupants, who lay asleep or weeping. Mr. Lorry, Dr. Manette, Lucy, little Lucy, and Sidney Carton. Then they let it pass. The carriage clattered out into the silent countryside, and only the wild wind rushed after them. At the same time, Madame Defarge was holding a meeting in the woodcutter's house by the prison. "The Evermond family must all be wiped out," she shouted. "The wife and the child must follow him to the guillotine. I can't trust my husband in this matter. He's too fond of the doctor." She called to the woodcutter. "Are you ready to bear witness that his wife stood by the prison window every day, signaling to her husband?" The woodcutter touched his red cap and nodded. Then he hurried to watch the 3 o'clock executions. "I'll go for her now," Madame Defarge said. "But I'll be at the guillotine before the carts arrive. We'll denounce her tonight." Madame Defarge had no pity. She did not care that an innocent man should die for the sins of his family. She walked on in her ragged dress and red cap, a pistol and dagger under her clothes. Miss Pross was preparing to leave by a later carriage. Suddenly she cried out, because Madame Defarge was standing in the room. "The wife of Evrémonde! Where is she?" she demanded in French. "You look like the devil's wife," Miss Pross replied in English, "but you won't get the better of me." Neither understood the other's words, but they understood the sense of them. "I've been in the streets since the first day of the Revolution," Madame Defarge shouted. "I'll tear you to pieces if you don't move from that door." As she ran forward, Miss Pross caught her round the waist. There was a blinding flash as Madame Defarge reached for her pistol and slumped to the floor. Miss Pross locked the door and hurried away, dropping the key into the river as she went. She did not hear the carts rumbling to the guillotine, for in that crack of the pistol she had become quite deaf. The clocks are striking 3. The chairs by the guillotine are full of women, busy with their knitting, apart from one, Madame Defarge. "She's never missed an execution before," one of the women says. The supposed Evrémonde gets down from the cart. "Keep your eyes on me, child," he whispers to a young girl next to him in the line. They stand together. "Is the moment come?" she asks at last. "Yes," Carton replies. He kisses her, and she is gone. 22, the knitting women count. "I am the resurrection and the life," Sidney Carton thinks. Number 23. He climbs the steps to the guillotine. The crowd has never seen such peace on the face of a man going to his death. And Sidney Carton is heard to whisper at the foot of the scaffold these words: "It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known."
Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. Retold by Anna Kirwan. The characters. Tom Sawyer. Tom, an orphan, has learned to be independent. Will he learn more from doing what he is told or from taking risks? Aunt Polly. Well-meaning Aunt Polly wants the best for her young charges. But how can she feel proud of young Tom when he keeps lying to her? Sid Sawyer. Sid is Tom's younger half-brother. If he can get Tom into trouble when he deserves it, will that keep him from going to heaven too soon? Huckleberry Finn. Huck is homeless and unschooled. He has both freedom and friendship, but is that enough? Becky Thatcher. Becky is new in town and is intrigued by Tom. She knows he is a rascal and a hero, but can he be a good sweetheart? Injun Joe. Without tribe or loyalty, Injun Joe thirsts for revenge. People are afraid of him, but is that the same as respect? Muff Potter. Muff wouldn't hurt a flea, but could drink turn him into a murderer? If only he could remember. Tom Sawyer. Tom? No answer. Tom? What's wrong with that boy? You, Tom. Aunt Polly caught Tom Sawyer escaping. "Hand me that switch," she ordered. "Oh no, look behind you," Tom cried out. Then he fled, disappearing over the fence. "He's played tricks on me before, Aunt Polly complained. "But he's my dead sister's boy, poor thing. He knows if he can make me laugh, I can't hit him. Well, I'll make him work tomorrow." At supper, Aunt Polly checked to see if Tom had cut class to go swimming. She'd sewn his loose button on that morning and stitched his collar closed. Pulling off his shirt to swim would have broken the thread, but his collar remained stitched. "Warm today, wasn't it, Tom?" she said. "Yes'm." A scare shot through Tom. "Ben pumped on our heads. Mine's damp yet, see?" Aunt Polly took this as gospel truth until Sid, Tom's younger half-brother, observed, "I thought you used white thread. Now it's black." Tom's ploy was exposed. Sid would catch it later. Now Tom was out the door. Saturday, Tom surveyed the fence, and all gladness left him. It was 90 feet and mighty high. Life seemed hollow. Sighing, he passed his brush along the first plank, compared the streak with the huge unpainted area, and sat down, discouraged. He thought of fun he'd planned. Soon his schoolmates would come and make fun of him working. Just then, inspiration struck. He took up his brush. Ben came into sight, eating an apple, and making whooping and ding-dong sounds to impersonate a steamboat. Tom painted, then surveyed the effect with an artist's eye. Ben stared. "Got to work, Tom?" No answer. Tom went on working until he wheeled suddenly. "Why, it's you, Ben. I warn't noticing. I'm going a swimming. Course, you'd rather work, wouldn't you?" Tom contemplated. "What do you call work? Ain't that work?" Tom resumed painting and answered carelessly, "Well, maybe it is, maybe it ain't. Does a boy get a chance to paint a fence every day?" Ben stopped nibbling. Tom swept his brush back and forth, stepped back, added a touch. Ben said, "Tom, let me paint a little." Tom considered. "No, it wouldn't do, Ben. My aunt's awful particular." "Let me just try, only just a little. I'd let you, Tom." "Ben, honest, if anything was to happen, I'll give you my apple." Tom gave up the brush, reluctance in his face, but cheerfulness in his heart. While Ben worked, other boys happened along. They came to jeer, but remained to paint. Ben wore out. Tom traded next to Billy for a kite. Johnny bought in for a dead rat, and so on. By afternoon, Tom was rolling in wealth. Marbles, blue glass, a key, chalk, a tin soldier, tadpoles, firecrackers, a one-eyed kitten, a brass doorknob, a dog collar, no dog, a knife handle, orange peel, and an old window frame. He'd had a nice time and plenty of company, and now the fence had 3 coats of paint. Tom had discovered a great law. For a person to want a thing, it's only necessary to make the thing difficult to get. Work's whatever one has to do. Play's whatever one doesn't have to do. Before school Monday, Tom encountered Huckleberry Finn, son of the town drunkard. Huck didn't attend school or church. Homeless, he came and went of his own free will. Mothers hated and dreaded him, but the children all admired and wished they dared be like him. Tom was no different. "Hello, Huckleberry. What's that?" "Dead cat, to cure warts." Tom had never heard that method, although he knew several, involving beans and particular words. "You go to the graveyard," explained Huck, "at midnight, when somebody wicked's been buried. Devils will come take the dead. Throw the cat after them, and the warts will follow. Hoss Williams was buried Saturday. He weren't likely going to heaven, so I aimed to watch his grave." "Let me go with you?" Tom asked. "I'll meow outside your window tonight." At school, Tom sat next to Becky Thatcher, the new girl he'd been showing off for. He gave her a peach, and then he drew a picture and wrote some words, which he hid. Becky made him show her. He had written, "I love you." "Oh, you bad thing," Becky said, but she blushed and looked pleased. When recess came and everyone else went to lunch, they met in the lane, walked, talked, shared chewing gum, and got engaged. "Do you remember what I wrote?" asked Tom. "Can I say it?" "Yes, but some other time." "No, now, please. I'll whisper it ever so easy." Tom passed his arm around her waist and whispered close to her ear. "Now you," he entreated. "You mustn't ever tell," Becky whispered. "I love you." They played and chased around the desks and benches until they stopped dodging and kissed. Then Tom said too much. He mentioned his past sweetheart's name. Becky's feelings were hurt. Tom didn't see why they should be, since he hadn't known her then. But Becky wouldn't trust him. Then Tom's feelings were hurt. He left her there and didn't come back to school that afternoon. He escaped to Cardiff Hill, his soul torn by loneliness. He thought of the people he knew who died, and imagined how Becky would feel if he disappeared. If only he could run away and be an Indian. Or no, better, a pirate. Tom lay awake that night listening. A cricket began chirping. Next, the ghastly ticking of the death watch beetle made him shudder. Somebody's days were numbered. Then a far-off dog howled. The clock chimed 11. A cat-like cry in the alley raised a neighbor's cry of, "Scat, you devil!" 1 minute later, Tom was up and out through his window. Huckleberry was there with his dead cat. They headed off silently. A half-hour later, faint wind moaning through the trees. Tom and Huck hid silently within the protection of 3 elms close to the fresh grave. Tom seized Huck's arm. "Shh! Hear it? Tom, the devils are coming. If we're still, maybe they won't notice us." Figures approached, one carrying a lantern. "Oh, Tom, it's devil fire." "Devils, all right. 3 of them." Tom began to say his prayers, but Huck interrupted. "They're humans. One of 'em's Muff Potter. He won't notice us. He's drunk." "I know another of them voices," Tom whispered. "Injun Joe." "I'd rather they was devils," said Huck. Injun Joe was known as a thief and a knife fighter, a man without a tribe, treacherous to all. "What are they up to?" The one with the lantern was Doc Robinson. The others had a wheelbarrow and shovels. They were stealing the corpse for the doctor to dissect. Doc Robinson sat right against one of the elms. Finally, spades struck coffin. The men hoisted it out, pried it open, dumped the body on the ground. "Now another $5, demanded Potter. "What? I've paid you." "You owe us more," growled Injun Joe. "5 years ago I come asking for food. Your father had me jailed. Think I'd forget?" His fist was in the doctor's face. The doctor struck out suddenly and knocked the ruffian down. "Don't hit my pard," Potter cried. Dropping his knife, he grappled with the doctor. Injun Joe crept around them, cat-like. The doctor seized the grave's headboard and knocked Potter down. In that instant, Injun Joe picked up Potter's knife and struck it into the doctor's chest. The doctor collapsed, bleeding. The clouds blotted out the dreadful sight. The 2 frightened boys sped away in the dark, back toward town, speechless with horror. Hidden in the old tannery, they caught their breath. Tom whispered, "Huckleberry, what do you reckon'll come of this?" "If Doc Robinson dies, I reckon hanging'll come of it." "Who'll tell, though? Should we?" "Injun Joe'd kill us. Let Potter do it, if he's fool enough. He's drunk enough." "Huck, Muff didn't know it. He just got that whack." "That's so. Tom, we gotta keep quiet. Look-a-here, let's swear, in writing, signed in blood." Tom picked up a shingle, found a crayon in his pocket, and wrote, "Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer swear they will keep quiet about this, and they wish they may drop down dead in their tracks if they ever tell, and rot." They pricked their thumbs and signed their initials. Tom showed Huck how to make H and F. School let out when the murder was discovered. Someone recognized Muff Potter's knife. Curiosity drew everybody to the scene. The sheriff led Potter to the bodies. Because he'd been drunk, Muff didn't remember who'd done it. Injun Joe accused him. The boys heard the stony-hearted lie and were astonished lightning didn't strike. Their impulse to break their oath vanished. Satan owned the murderer. To tell'd be fatal. Potter went to jail, where Tom visited him every day. Every night Tom had nightmares. Many would have liked to tar and feather Injun Joe for grave robbing, but none dared. That wasn't all. Becky wasn't coming to school. She was ill. Tom was miserable. What if she should die? He became so dreary, Aunt Polly dosed him with quack medicine. After several weeks, Becky got better and returned to school. Tom showed off, but she turned up her nose, still hurt by his past sweetheart. Tom knew he couldn't go on so, scorned, betrayed, with a murderer in the vicinity, and his conscience torturing him about Muff. There seemed nothing left but a life of crime. He ran into Joe Harper, who had been ill-used, too. He'd been punished for drinking cream he never tasted. Joe approved Tom's plan to become pirates. They could camp downriver on Jackson's Island, alongside the Illinois shore. Nobody lived there. They'd leave St. Petersburg, Missouri, behind. They hunted up Huckleberry, and he joined promptly. That night, they swiped a log raft. Tom and Joe brought a ham and a side of bacon. They shoved off presently. Tom Sawyer, the Black Avenger, Huck Finn, the Red-Handed, and Joe Harper, the Terror of the Seas, with Tom in command. They steered out into the current. They were river boys, so they knew what they were doing. About 2 in the morning, they landed on the island, carried their gear ashore, and set up camp. They discussed kidnapping, ransom, and proper flashy pirate costumes. Huck sat by the campfire. Tom and Joe decided they needed sleep. It was easy for Huck, but Joe and Tom both got to worrying. Taking an apple without permission was one thing, but a whole ham might be actual stealing. They weren't those kind of pirates. Tom awoke in the dawn calm of the woods. Ash covered the fire. Blue breath of smoke rose into the air. Joe and Huck still slept. Tom watched bugs a while. Catbirds and jaybirds called close above. Squirrels and foxes approached. Tom realized they'd never seen a human. He woke the others. They jumped up and waded out to swim. A current had taken the raft away. This was good. It was like burning the bridge between them and civilization. Tom found a spring. Huck and Tom caught bass, a sun perch, and a catfish. They built up their fire and fried the fish with bacon. Nobody was homesick. They explored and swam every hour, ate ham for lunch, and talked. Later in the afternoon it got hot, and they grew thoughtful, homesick. Even Finn the Red-Handed felt strange without doorsteps, empty barrels, and some bit of roof overhead. About this time they noticed a sound repeating at intervals, like a muffled boom. "Ain't thunder," said Huckleberry. They hid by the shore. The ferry boat was mid-channel. A burst of smoke came from it, and the same boom. A cannon. "Somebody's drowned," Tom exclaimed. "That's it," said Huck. "Wish I knew who it is," said Joe. A thought flashed through Tom's mind. "It's us." They felt like heroes. They were missed. Hearts were breaking because of them, tears being shed. Unkindness to these poor lost lads remembered with remorse. They were the talk of the town. It was worth it to be a pirate. They had fish for supper, but grew quiet. At home, certain people weren't enjoying the drama. As night deepened, Huck and Joe fell asleep, but Tom got up. By firelight, he found 2 fragments of bark. He wrote 2 notes. He put one in Joe's cap, pocketed the other, went down to the sandbar, and started wading. Halfway across, the current required swimming, and he was swept downstream faster than he expected. Finally ashore, he struck north through the woods. Before 10, he came opposite the town. He hid in the skiff tied to the ferry. Later that night, the ferry crossed. Almost there, Tom slipped overboard and swam ashore. At his aunt's, he peeped in the parlor window. There were Aunt Polly, Sid, and Joe's mother. Tom inched the door open until he could crawl through, hidden in the shadow behind the sofa bed. "What makes the candle blow?" said Aunt Polly. "Sid, that door's open. Go 'long and shut it." Tom disappeared under the bed just in time. Tom wasn't bad, Aunt Polly was saying, only mischievous. He was the best-hearted boy. She began to cry. "Just so with my Joe. To think I forgot I threw that cream out myself because it soured." "I hope Tom's better off where he is," said Sid. "But if he'd been better—" "Sid!" Tom felt Aunt Polly's glare without seeing it. "Not a word against my Tom." "It's hard," Mrs. Harper grieved. "To think, last Saturday Joe busted a firecracker under my nose, and I knocked him sprawling. Little did I know then. If I had to do it over, I'd hug him and bless him for it." Aunt Polly confessed she'd punished Tom unfairly for something Sid did. Tom was so touched he longed to rush out and overwhelm her with joy. But he resisted and lay still to learn more. Discovering the raft missing, they'd reckoned the boys took it. When it was found, miles downriver, hope had perished. The funerals would be preached Sunday. Sobbing, Mrs. Harper said good night, and the family turned in. Tom waited until Aunt Polly slept, then slipped out, kissed her dear old face, and escaped. He didn't leave the note. He had a better idea. He was back to camp before breakfast. They were a boastful company once they heard his report. They hunted turtle nests and had fried egg feasts. They swam where the current tripped them and increased the fun. They buried themselves in sand, played circus, played marbles, and swam again. Tom found himself writing Becky in the sand with his toe. Joe grew so homesick he could hardly endure it. Huck, too. Tom had to tell them his secret plan so they wouldn't talk of leaving. The weather turned rough. Near midnight, a weird flash turned night into day. A deep crash of thunder sent the boys for cover under the sycamore tree. One blinding flash came after another, with drenching rain. The tempest rose higher. Their tent tore loose and went flying away. They fled down to the riverbank and huddled miserably until the storm passed. When they returned to camp, they discovered the sycamore had been blasted by lightning. They were awed they weren't underneath when it happened. It was a very still Sabbath. The townsfolk talked little and sighed often. Becky found herself at the deserted schoolhouse. "It was right here," she said to herself. "But he's gone now. I'll never see him any more." Tears rolled down her cheeks. The bell tolled. None remembered church so full before. Tom's family entered, followed by the Harpers. A hymn was sung. The minister spoke of the winning ways and rare promise of the lost lads. He related touching incidents which illustrated their sweet, generous natures. How noble! Even their pranks, for which many had blamed them, now seemed beautiful. Everyone broke down in sobs, including the preacher. There was a rustle in back. The minister stood transfixed. Other eyes followed his. Then all leaped up, staring. The dead boys marched up the aisle. They'd been listening to their own funeral. Their families smothered them with thankful kisses, while poor unmissed Huck stood abashed, not knowing what to do. But Tom grabbed him. "Aunt Polly, it ain't fair. Somebody's got to be glad to see Huck. I'm glad to see him, poor motherless thing." Aunt Polly's loving attentions made Huck more uncomfortable than before. "Praise God! Sing!" shouted the minister. The triumphant burst shook the rafters. Tom looked around at all the envying kids. He'd never been prouder. At breakfast Monday, Aunt Polly was very loving. "But you could have come," said Aunt Polly, "and give me a hint you weren't dead." "That would have spoiled everything," said Tom, discomforted. "Tom, I hoped you loved me that much. If you'd cared enough to think of it, Sid would have thought and done it too." "Auntie, I care for you," said Tom. "I dreamed about you." "What did you dream?" "It's dim now. I dreamt you there by the bed, and Sid and Joe's mother was here." "Why, she was here." "And you said the door was open." "So I did." "And when you went to bed I was so sorry. I took a piece of bark and wrote you a note, and then I leaned over and kissed you." "Did you, Tom? Honey, I forgive you everything for just saying that." "Yes, that was very kind, even if it was only a dream," Sid muttered. "Shut up, Sid," she ordered. "A body does the same in a dream as if he was awake." What a hero Tom was at school! Smaller boys flocked at his heels, though boys his age pretended not to care about his glittering notoriety. Tom decided glory was sufficient. He didn't need love. He pretended not to see Becky, but joined a group talking. Becky chased schoolmates, screaming with laughter and making all her captures near him. He wouldn't notice. He talked with his old girlfriend. Becky came up to another girl in the group and invited her to a picnic. "Oh, won't it be fun? Who'll come?" "Everyone that's friends with me, or wants to be," Becky said. But Tom talked on. As word got around, everyone sought invitations. Everyone but Tom and his old sweetheart. When they left, Becky felt trembly. She hid and had a good cry. She knew what she'd do. When Tom next saw her, she was with the most snobbish boy in town. Tom began to hate himself for ignoring Becky's invitation. He was a fool. No girl but Becky mattered. He fled home at noon. And Becky, miserable that Tom had gone, told the city boy to go. He wondered what he'd done, then realized who was to blame. He went into the empty classroom and poured ink into Tom's spelling book to get him in trouble. Becky, glancing in, saw him. Her first thought was to tell, but then Tom's treatment of her came scorching back and filled her with shame. She'd let Tom get punished and hate him forever. At home, Aunt Polly ambushed Tom. Joe told his mother about Tom's eavesdropping. Aunt Polly was ashamed of Tom's lie, of believing it, and of her friends knowing. "Auntie, I didn't mean to be mean. I did come to tell you we was just playing." "I'd give worlds to believe that." "But I couldn't bear to spoil the funeral. I put the bark back in my pocket." "Tom, did you really kiss me good night?" "Of course I did. I missed you." The moment he'd gone, she ran to the closet to find his jacket, then stopped. "I reckon he's lying," she said to herself, "but it's a blessed lie and a comfort." A moment later she was reading the bark through tears, saying, "I could forgive him a million sins." Tom was feeling happy, therefore, when he found Becky in Meadow Lane. "Becky, I'm so sorry. Please, can we make up?" She looked at him scornfully. "I'll never speak to you again." She walked past him. Tom was stunned. Becky wanted to see Tom beaten over the spelling book. She went into the classroom early to wait. Now, the schoolmaster kept a book he studied at quiet moments. No student knew what absorbed him. Today, Becky noticed his desk unlocked. Daring to open the drawer in the book, she saw the word anatomy, and on the first page, a human figure, stark naked. Just then, Tom stepped in and saw. Becky slammed the book closed too fast, and the picture tore. She burst out crying. "You're mean. If you tell, I'll be whipped for the first time ever. Go ahead and be so hateful." She ran off. "Never been punished," Tom mused. "What's a switching? Well, I ain't tellin'. But he'll ask who done this. Her eyes will show it." Recess ended. Becky's worried face troubled Tom. Spelling began, and Tom's ink-ruined book was discovered. Tom vainly maintained his innocence, but was switched anyway. Becky almost told who'd really done it, but she kept quiet. Eventually, the master unlocked his desk and reached for his book. Tom glanced at Becky. She looked like a hunted rabbit. Instantly, he forgot their quarrel. Something must be done. The master faced the class. "Who tore this book?" Not a sound. The master looked at face after face for signs of guilt. He walked around the room and came closer to Becky. Tom sprang to his feet. "I done it." When he stepped forward for punishment, surprise, gratitude, and adoration shone from Becky's eyes. That night he fell asleep with her words lingering dreamily in his ear. "Tom, how could you be so noble?" The last day of school. Summer had begun, but Tom lacked cheer. Becky was away, and the dreadful secret of the murder was pain like a cancer. Then, finally, it was time for the trial. "Huck, have you ever told?" "Of course not." "Reckon Muff's a goner," Tom guessed. "I feel sorry for him," Huck admitted. "Lots of times he stood by me when I was down. Wish we could get him out. Folks want to lynch him." They had a long talk. The trial began. After 2 days, Tom realized that Injun Joe's testimony was to stay unchallenged. Tom was out late that night. The next morning the courtroom was packed. The jury filed in. Potter, haggard, hopeless, with chains on him, Injun Joe, and the judge. Lawyers whispered and gathered papers. Witnesses gave circumstantial evidence, and Potter's lawyer didn't question them. At last he called one more witness. "Thomas Sawyer." Everyone gasped. Tom took the oath. "Where were you on June 17th at midnight?" Tom glanced at Injun Joe and could hardly speak aloud. "The graveyard." Injun Joe gave a barely perceptible start. Tom told everything. As the doctor hit Muff, Injun Joe jumped with the knife. Crash! Injun Joe tore through everyone, sprang through a window, and was gone. Tom was a hero again. His name was in the paper, but Injun Joe infested his dreams. He would want revenge. Rewards were offered, and everyone looked, but Injun Joe had vanished. One day Tom got an urge to dig for buried treasure. Robbers, Tom knew, hid treasure under dead trees and in haunted houses. He and Huck dug under a tree for a while, then carried their tools to an abandoned house. They crept in, talking in whispers, dropped their tools in a corner, and ascended the staircase. "Shh," said Tom. "Hear it? Keep still." They stretched on the floor, eyes to the trap door. Downstairs 2 men entered. One of the men they'd never seen before. The other, an old deaf and dumb Spaniard who'd been around town lately. "It's too dangerous," the first man said. "Nonsense." The sound of that voice terrified the boys. It was Injun Joe. "This last job," Injun Joe insisted. "Then we'll leave for Texas." "What about the swag we've got? 650 in silver is heavy." "Bury it." "Good idea." Digging with a knife, they raised a hearthstone. The blade hit something. "A box," Injun Joe gasped. "It's money. Gold. Thousands." "They said Merle's gang used to hide out around here. Now we don't need to do that job." "This job's not robbery. It's revenge." "Should we rebury this till later?" "No. There's tools with fresh dirt on 'em over there. The owners will come back. We'll take it to my den, number 2, under the cross." It was getting dark. Injun Joe and his partner carried their chest toward the river. Upstairs, Tom and Huck dared to breathe again. "Revenge?" Tom shuddered. "What if he means me?" That night, both boys dreamed of treasure. Meeting up the next morning, they resolved to find Injun Joe's den. The town lacked street numbers, but one tavern had a locked room, too, with an alley door. The first overcast night, Huck and Tom investigated. The Spaniard was there, passed out drunk, but there was no chest. They'd have to watch longer, to follow Injun Joe to the money. Becky's family returned. Injun Joe and even Merle's treasure sank in importance for Tom. The long-promised picnic would happen the next day. The Thatchers chartered the ferry. Becky told her mother she'd spend the night at the Harper's house, which was near the ferry. The boat carried the party downriver to a wooded hollow where they ate. Then all the children took candles and began exploring McDougal's cave. The hill was honeycombed with intersecting aisles and labyrinths underneath labyrinths. No man knew the whole cave, but Tom knew as much as anyone. All afternoon in the cavern, groups slipped aside, eluding or surprising each other among the shadowy corridors. By the time they came straggling out, laughing and covered with clay and candle drippings, it was evening. The ferry captain was growing impatient. Huck saw the ferry's lights pass homeward along the riverfront. He hadn't been to the picnic. He decided to make good use of his time and was watching the alley. After a time, two men emerged, carrying a box. Huck cautiously glided behind them. They turned up Cardiff Hill and climbed past the Welshman's house. In the darkness, Huck suddenly heard a low voice only feet away. They'd stopped outside the Widow Douglas house. Huck's heart felt a chill. Revenge. "Her husband had me horsewhipped like a slave," Injun Joe whispered to his companion. "Maybe I'll scar up her face as revenge and leave her to bleed to death. But not tonight. She has company. We'll wait till she's alone." Huck backed away, then sped downhill to the Welshman's place and banged on the door. "Don't tell I told," he begged. "Injun Joe'd kill me." The Welshman and his sons listened to Huck, then went ahead of him up the path toward the widow's. When shots rang out, Huck ran. At dawn, Huck tapped at the Welshman's door. "Who's there?" "Only Huck Finn. Always welcome here." Strange words, the pleasantest Huck had ever heard, and followed by, "Hope you're hungry. We'll have a hot breakfast." Huck learned that last night's villains weren't dead, nor even caught, but the widow was unharmed. She knew of the foiled attack on her, but not that Huck had been involved. The Welshman said the box had held burglars' tools. Huck didn't mention the gold. At church, Mrs. Thatcher asked Mrs. Harper about Becky. "Didn't she stay with you last night?" "No." Aunt Polly joined them. "And Tom said she might stay with Joe," she said. "No." Nobody'd seen Tom or Becky since yesterday. They'd been left behind, deep in the cave. Alarm swept the town. Rescuers poured forth. All afternoon the town was empty. The cavern was searched. The names Becky and Tom were found written on a wall, but not the children. Huck came down with delirious fever. The Widow Douglas took him in and cared for him. For 3 days the search continued. When Tom and Becky'd first gone into the cave, they'd visited all the familiar wonders. Then hide-and-seek began. Presently they were really exploring, blazing their trail, curious. They found stalactites, a spring lined with crystals, pillars of dewy stone, and they were bewitched. But then bats swooped down, extinguishing Becky's candle. The bats chased them. They dodged away through the corridors, eventually escaping the bats without losing Tom's light, too. When they tried to find their last mark, though, they realized the awful truth. They were lost. They shouted, but there was no answer except horrid echoes. They walked on, hoping to find something familiar. They had only bits of candle left, and one small piece of cake. Long hours passed. They rested sometimes. Coming to a spring, Tom said they should stay there, since they'd reached their last candle. "Tom, they'll hunt for us, I reckon." But then they remembered that nobody expected them Saturday night. The last candle melted. Becky cried and slept. Tom watched over her. He thought it must be Sunday already. Once they heard shouts far away and shouted back. Nobody came. While Becky slept, Tom used kite string to retrace his steps, exploring as far as he could in the pitch darkness. He found a passage which ended in a jumping-off place. Tom crouched to discover how deep it was. Then, not 60 feet away, a hand holding a candle appeared from behind a rock. Tom shouted, then stopped, paralyzed, when he saw who it was. It was Injun Joe. Luckily, the murderer vanished. Tom didn't tell Becky. She'd grown weak. She wouldn't walk now. She expected to die there. Tom pretended he believed they'd be rescued. Tom explored the cave, hour after hour. How long had they been lost? Finally, he glimpsed faraway daylight, groped toward the small hole, and saw the Mississippi. Becky had already given up hope. He had to coax her to come with him. Once outside, they sat and cried for gladness. Tom hailed a skiff. At first, the boatman didn't believe his story. They were 5 miles away from McDougal's cave. They'd wandered a long way underground. But once convinced, the men brought them back upriver. Late Tuesday night, the stillness was broken by wild bells and cries of, "They're found!" Folks surged toward the river, met Becky and Tom, and made a parade back to town. Word was sent to the searchers and to Judge Thatcher. Aunt Polly and Mrs. Thatcher were joyous. It was a glorious night. 3 days and nights of toil and hunger had exhausted Tom and Becky. Tom didn't go out until Friday, Becky not till Sunday. First, Tom visited Huck at the widow's house. The body of Injun Joe's partner was found in the river. 2 weeks later, Tom was visiting Becky. The judge's friends asked Tom if he'd ever go caving again. Tom said he wouldn't mind, now he'd recovered. The judge assured them that nobody'd get lost in McDougal's cave again. He'd had its wooden door iron-sheathed and triple-locked. Tom turned white. But Injun Joe's in there. Skiff slid out, with Tom in the judge's boat. They unlocked the cave. Injun Joe lay just inside, dead. Tom knew how the wretch had suffered, but he was so relieved. He realized how terrified he'd been for months. The murderer had hacked at the door to no avail and broken off a stalagmite to catch drip water, 1 drop every 3 minutes. Those drops had been falling when the pyramids were new. Did they fall patiently for 5,000 years just to fill this human insect's need? After gnawing the wax of candle stubs and even trying to catch bats, Injun Joe had starved to death. They buried him outside the cave. Tom and Huck finally got to talk privately. "Huck, that money wasn't in that room. I bet it's in the cave, and there's a way in that don't anybody but me know." They took string, matches, candles, and bags to carry gold. They borrowed a skiff and headed downriver. Below the cave, Tom showed Huck where he and Becky had escaped. "Robbers need a place like this. We've got it now." Inside, they unwound their string as they searched for the spring. Once there, Tom showed Huck the last bit of candle end. Then he said, "Do you see that, on the big rock?" "A cross! Under the cross!" "Tom, let's get away. Injun Joe's ghost." "He'll stay where he died, miles from here." "No, he'll guard his treasure." "Not under a cross he won't." "That's true," Huck conceded. They dug and scratched, found boards, removed them, and then found a hidden cavern concealing the treasure box. "We're rich, Tom." They plowed their hands through the coins. They were glad they'd brought bags to carry it home. They got back to town after dark, planning to hide the money and divide it in the morning. They ran into the Welshman, though, who insisted that they join him at a party at the widow's, though Huck was shy in crowds. They found half the town gathered. The widow sent clean clothes upstairs for them. It was 2 outfits she'd bought for Huck while he was sick. "Tom, I ain't one for parties. The window ain't high. I can get away." "Shucks, it ain't anything." Sid came in looking smug. "The widow's giving this party for Mr. Jones," he informed them. "For saving her. He thinks everybody'll be surprised Huckleberry's the one who really done it. I heard him tell Aunt, but everybody knows." "Was it you that told?" "Somebody told." Tom chased him out, vowing to get even. At supper, the Welshman made his speech. He started going on and on about someone else's modesty. Then he sprung his dramatic secret, and the widow, at least, showed astonishment. She heaped Huck with such compliments and gratitude he almost forgot the discomfort of new clothes in the discomfort of everybody's gaze. The widow said she meant to give Huck a home and an education, then eventually start him in business. "Huck doesn't need it," Tom announced. "Huck's rich." Everyone thought he was joking until he fetched the money bags and poured out yellow coins. "Half of it's Huck, half's mine." Astonishment erupted. Tom told all. The money totaled $12,000, more than anyone there had ever seen at one time. The windfall made a mighty stir in the town. Everyone talked about it. Every haunted house was ransacked. Everything the boys did seemed to be regarded as remarkable. The newspaper even published biographical sketches. The adults invested the money for the boys. They got $1 a day as an allowance. $1.25 a week would board, lodge, and school a boy in those days, and clothe and wash him, too. The judge said no ordinary boy could have rescued Becky. When she told him how Tom had saved her at school, he thought it was noble and generous, and said Tom was destined to be a great lawyer someday. The widow's protection and his own wealth plunged Huck into society. He could hardly bear having servants keep him neat, having to use a fork and napkin, learning to read and speak correctly. The shackles of civilization bound him. After 3 weeks, he disappeared. Everyone worried. Only Tom knew to check the abandoned slaughterhouse. In an empty barrel, he found the refugee, in comfort, uncombed, clad in rags, and content. "I've tried it, Tom. I can't stand them ways. I can't stand being up the same time every morning. Clothes that smothers me and shoes all Sunday." "Everybody does that, Huck." "I ain't everybody, and it ain't for me. That money is trouble. Just take my share and beg off for me with a widder." "Huck, you know you can't do that. Them cussed smothery houses. I like woods, the river. We've got us a cave. Being rich ain't stopping me from being a robber, but if you want to be in the gang, you've got to be respectable. Robbers are higher class than pirates, Huck." "Tom, you wouldn't shut me out." "Huck, I wouldn't want to, but what would people say?" Huck was silent. Finally he said, "I'll go back for a month and see if I can stand it, if you'll have me in the gang." "All right," Tom said. He was already planning another adventure. We'll get the boys together and have the initiation at midnight.
Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, retold by Gil Taverner. The characters: Jane Eyre, plain, small and orphaned. Jane is alone in the world. Will she ever find the adventure she seeks and the affection she so desperately needs? Mrs. Reed. Mrs. Reed is Jane's cold, cruel aunt. Does she have the power to make Jane miserable forever? Helen Burns. Gentle Helen is Jane's best friend. How will she influence Jane? Is she strong enough to survive? Mr. Rochester. Mr. Rochester is dark and brooding, but full of fire. Why does he hate his home? What secret does he keep locked away? Adele. Adele is Mr. Rochester's charge and Jane's pupil. Will she like her new governess? Grace Poole. Why does this servant live alone on the third story? Is it she who haunts the night with savage laughter? What is her deadly secret? St. John Rivers. St. John is handsome and clever. Will he help to heal Jane's broken heart? Jane Eyre. Where are you, Jane, you ugly rat? Come out, wherever you are. I cowered cross-legged on the window seat behind the crimson curtain, my book still open in my trembling lap. My cousin John flung back the curtain. There you are. Stand up right now. I obeyed him. What do you want? Say, what do you want, Master Reed? I forced myself to raise my eyes to his face. What do you want, Master Reed? 4 years older than me, with dull eyes and fat cheeks, John Reed bullied me continuously. Every part of my 10-year-old body feared him. Now I waited for him to hit me. He struck me hard. I tottered backwards, hitting my head against the door frame. My head bled. Stand up, orphan, shouted John. You should be begging in the streets, not living here at Mamma's expense. The fire of rebellion ignited within me. You are wicked and cruel, I shouted. John ran headlong at me, calling, Mamma, help me! Jane is in a fury. We struggled together for a few minutes before my aunt appeared with Bessie, her servant. Take her to the Red Room and lock her in, Mrs. Reed commanded. Once the fire in my blood had cooled, I looked around me. My prison was a large, stately room, which had been left cold and silent since my uncle died in there 9 years ago. My parents had died of typhus when I was a baby. My uncle had vowed to take care of me, but his own untimely death 1 year later left this responsibility to his resentful wife. What would he have thought of my imprisonment? The hours passed. I grew as cold as stone. The eerie light of the autumn evening stirred my imagination. What if my uncle's ghost appeared now, in this room where he had died? My heart beat rapidly. My head grew hot. Fear possessed me, and I threw myself against the door. Let me out! Let me out! My aunt's angry footsteps stopped outside. For this outburst, her cold voice decreed, you must stay an extra hour. Oh, Aunt, have pity, I sobbed. She walked away. Autumn became winter. One cold January morning, summoned to my aunt's presence, I found myself standing before a tall man dressed in black. I'm sending you to boarding school, my aunt told me. This is Mr. Brocklehurst, the master of the school. The man looked down at me with stony eyes. You are small and plain, he observed. Are you a good little girl? His deep voice scared me. I was unable to answer. My aunt filled the silence. I am afraid she has many faults, Mr. Brocklehurst, the worst of which is deceit. Warn her teachers. Deceit? Boomed Mr. Brocklehurst. He stooped to look into my eyes. Deceitful children go to hell. He turned back to my aunt. I will warn everybody. I struggled to suppress a sob. I now fully understood my aunt's power to hurt me. However hard I tried, I had never won her affection. Now she sowed her hatred and unkindness along my future path. Keep her humble, Mr. Brocklehurst. I never want to see her again. On the day of my departure, I burned with resentment for the treatment I had received from my aunt in the past, and the treatment she had insured me in the future. As I stood before her to say farewell, her icy eyes dwelt freezingly upon me, but they failed to cool my fire. Something over which I had no control spoke out of me. "I will never call you aunt again," I trembled. "Your miserable cruelty makes me sick. You are deceitful, not me. You think because I am poor and plain that I can live without any human kindness. I cannot." My aunt stood cold and silent as an iceberg. Bessie gently guided me into the awaiting coach. I was to travel to Lowood alone. Lowood School sat in a dark, damp valley. Entering the grounds, I saw girls huddling in groups, with no shelter from the wind and rain. They were all without proper boots or gloves, their brown dresses offering insufficient protection. All were pale and thin. On my first morning in the cold, dimly lit dining room, I learned that the food at Lowood was tasteless and inadequate. From that moment, my stomach ached for food. As I passed the teacher's table on my way out, I heard an elegant lady dressed in purple whisper, "What abominable food! How shameful!" As the weeks passed, we were all weakened by cold and hunger. We gathered ever closer around the small fires. Although usually absent, Mr. Brocklehurst kept strict control over Lowood's budget, allowing very little for food, clothing, or fuel. Occasionally, the elegant teacher in purple would secure for us a little extra bread. "Miss Temple is the kindest teacher," my new friend Helen Burns told me. "She is full of goodness." I made good progress in my studies, and the other girls accepted me. With Helen Burns's friendship I was, in my own way, happy. I had just one fear. When would Mr. Brocklehurst appear and turn everybody against me? The dreaded day arrived. Like a tower of cold black marble, Mr. Brocklehurst stood before us. "You," he shouted, pointing to one of the older girls whose curly red hair was rebelling against her morning's attempt to tie it neatly. "Your hair must be cut off entirely. Such vanity is not acceptable. You must learn modesty and duty." Then he looked at me. I saw recognition in his eyes. "Little girl," he boomed, "come here." He pulled a stool toward me. "Stand upon this stool." Trembling, I did as I was told. "Teachers and children," he addressed our audience, "the devil has found a servant in this girl. Exclude her from your games. Do not talk to her. This girl," he announced, "is a liar." There was silence. I felt everybody's eyes burning into me. Mr. Brocklehurst tied a label saying "Liar" around my neck. "Let her stand half an hour upon this stool." Hot tears of anger and humiliation threatened to escape from my eyes. Hearing a cough, I looked up to see Helen, her eyes shining with kindness. She smiled gently at me. It was a smile of true understanding and courage. My tears subsided. Around Helen's neck, I saw the familiar "Untidy" label she was often forced to wear. Poor Helen was frequently punished by one cruel teacher for her untidy ways. She bore the cane's sting patiently. "My punishments are deserved, so it is easy to bear them," she once told me. It is true, I am careless and untidy. "But I would seize the cane and break it," I had replied. "Life is too short for disagreements," coughed Helen. "We should love our enemies." Now, standing on the stool, I bore my punishment because I had to. I could not copy Helen's calm acceptance. That evening, Miss Temple invited Helen and me to her room. I held my head low. What must she think of me now? "Jane," Miss Temple soothed, "we shall think of you as we know you to be. Can you explain why Mr. Brocklehurst accused you of deceit?" Choking with tears, I told Miss Temple and Helen all about my aunt. Miss Temple smiled. "Your name is now clear. I will make sure that everybody knows." "You should try to forgive," Helen breathed with difficulty, and I noticed that her hollow cough was becoming more frequent. "Do not bear resentment when life is so short. Our reward is in heaven." Miss Temple looked sadly at Helen's pale face. When we stood to leave, she gave us each a gentle hug. I noticed that she gave a low sigh when she held Helen. Spring came, but the welcome sunshine was too gentle to combat the dreariness of Lowood's situation. Disease took a deadly hold of Lowood. Many girls died. Others escaped to relatives' homes. Lessons were suspended, and any girls free of illness were able to roam in the woods. I was still young. Enjoying my new freedom, I failed to realize how ill Helen had become. One evening, unable to sleep, I crept into Miss Temple's room, where Helen was being nursed. "How sad to be lying on a sick bed when the world is so pleasant," I exclaimed. Helen smiled weakly. "You are just in time to bid me good-bye," she whispered. "Are you going home?" I was puzzled. A coughing fit seized Helen. When it had passed, she lay back, exhausted. "No, Jane, I'm going to God." I was silent. Tears filled my eyes. "I am happy, Jane. I look forward to heaven." "Might I sleep beside you?" I whispered. I put my arms around my friend's neck and rested my cheek against hers. "Your warmth is comforting," sighed Helen. "Good night, Jane." "Good night, Helen." Miss Temple found me asleep the next morning, still holding my dear, dead friend. Following the deaths of so many girls, Mr. Brocklehurst was replaced by a committee of men who built a new school that was much healthier. I stayed 8 years at Lowood in total, 6 as a student and 2 as a teacher. I was happy there. At the age of 18, however, I longed for more. I frequently gazed at the distant horizon, and a desire grew within me to follow the road further than I could see. A world full of hopes, fears, excitement, and knowledge beckoned to me. I yearned for liberty. I decided to advertise my services as a governess. My advertisement attracted only one response, but that was all I needed. A few days later, I left the familiarity of Lowood for an unknown future as governess at Thornfield Hall. The journey was long. Although I felt the thrill of adventure and pride in my independence, I also felt the steady throb of fear. I shouldn't have been afraid. I received a warm welcome at Thornfield. The housekeeper, Mrs. Fairfax, maintained an atmosphere of domestic comfort. I met my new pupil, Adele, a lively 8-year-old French girl who was delighted by the French I had learned at Lowood. We soon grew fond of each other. Adele, accustomed to the finery of French fashion, often commented that my appearance was plain. I sometimes wished to be beautiful, to have rosy cheeks, a straight nose, and a tall, stately figure. Instead, I was small and pale, with irregular features. One evening I asked Mrs. Fairfax about our absent master. "Mr. Rochester is a good man," she told me. "Although a little strange. I'm never sure whether he's serious or joking when he talks to me." "Is he often at Thornfield?" "Very rarely, and we never know when to expect him." I wondered why a man would choose to be absent from such a comfortable home. I wondered what Mr. Rochester was like. Despite my developing happiness, restlessness was, and still is, in my nature. I always wonder what lies beyond the horizon. It seems most unfair that men are free to travel, to learn and experience life, while women are expected to be happy with baking, knitting, and embroidering. Mrs. Fairfax satisfied a little of my curiosity by showing me around Thornfield. Its size and style earned my admiration. The third story, however, which was above my own room, was darker and gloomier than the rest. If there were a ghost at Thornfield, I mused, this is where it would haunt. As we walked softly along the darkest passage, between the closed doors of empty rooms, an unexpected sound startled me. A strange laugh, hollow, low, and joyless, echoed around us. It was a tragic, unnatural sound. "Grace," called Mrs. Fairfax. "Too much noise." A solid woman with a hard face appeared from a door. She apologized to Mrs. Fairfax and returned to the room. "Grace Poole does the sewing," was Mrs. Fairfax's unsatisfactory explanation. I loved venturing beyond Thornfield. One cold afternoon I set out to deliver a letter. An early moon shone eerily through the freezing mist in the silent lanes. Enjoying the stillness, I was suddenly unnerved by the featureless, ghostly silhouette of a man on horseback. As he passed, his horse slipped on some ice. The horse and its mortal rider crashed to the ground. "Are you injured, sir? Can I help?" "Stand aside," the man panted, freeing himself from his horse and pulling it to its feet. "I only have a sprain," he grimaced. His rough, frowning manner gave me more confidence than politeness would have done. "I will not leave you, sir, until I see that you can mount your horse." "Then support me a moment," he said, leaning his tall body against me. "You should be at home yourself by now," he observed. "Where are you from?" "From Thornfield, sir. I am the new governess." "Ah, the governess. I had forgotten." He mounted his horse with some pain. "Hurry home. It will soon be dark." Once I had posted the letter, I returned reluctantly to the confines of Thornfield, where a surprise awaited me. Mrs. Fairfax greeted me at the door. "The master is here," she bustled. "He is injured. His horse slipped on some ice." "Ah, the roadside elf," a voice called from the dining room. "Come in here and greet me." I found Mr. Rochester alone before the fire, his bandaged foot raised before him. "So you are the supernatural being who bewitched my horse. I have you to thank for this injury." I stepped forward. He was not an attractive man, but I saw intelligence in his dark features, and humor sparkled in his eyes. He invited me to sit down. "Mrs. Fairfax tells me that you have taken great pains with Adele, and that she has made much improvement." "Thank you." I nodded and remained silent. "Do you play the piano?" he asked. "A little." "Play me a tune," he ordered. He must have seen the resistance in my eyes, for he checked himself. "Excuse my tone of command, Miss Eyre. It is habit. Would you please play me a tune?" I did as I was asked. You play better than many, but not well." Mrs. Fairfax met me on the stairs that night as I retired to my room. "You must excuse the master's manner," she whispered. "He has painful thoughts. He leads an unsettled life, and dislikes being at Thornfield. Mr. Rochester's presence brought new life to Thornfield. On many occasions he invited me to talk with him. I think he feared solitude. "Do you think me handsome, Miss Eyre?" he asked one evening. "No, sir." "By my word!" he exclaimed in surprise. "You seem so timid, yet you speak so bluntly. What fault do you find in me? Answer honestly." I apologized for my words, but I could not disown them. "Can you see any signs of the good man that I should have been had not fate decreed otherwise?" He sat thoughtfully for a while. I watched him. "How your eyes search my face and character, Miss Eyre! What do you see? Speak." I remained silent. "Ah," I asked rudely again. "I apologize. But cannot I claim superiority over you in both age and experience, having roamed over half of the world?" "That depends very much upon the use you have made of your years and experience," I answered. One afternoon, as we walked in the garden, Mr. Rochester seemed troubled. "I envy your clear conscience, Miss Eyre. I am poisoned by remorse. I am burdened, cursed by my past." He looked up toward the third story of his home, his eyes burning with sudden anger. He looked down at me and sighed. "Miss Eyre, I find you refresh me." My master was no longer unattractive to me. His face made me happy, and his presence cheered me. The night after our garden walk, my sleep was disturbed by a strange sound outside my bedroom door. I bolted upright, chilled with fear. It was the same low, eerie laughter I had heard in the dark corridor. "Who is there?" I called. The laughter stopped. Silence. I could scarcely breathe. A moaning, gurgling sound replaced the laughter. It moved away from my door. Why did Grace Poole laugh such an evil laugh? What was she doing now? I could smell smoke, so I got up to investigate. Peering from my room into the darkness, I saw thick smoke billowing from Mr. Rochester's door. In an instant, I was in his room. Tongues of flame licked the bed, in the middle of which my master lay motionless, asleep. "Wake! Wake!" I cried. I rushed to his basin, seized his water jug, and deluged the bed and its occupant. I then flew to my room for more water, which I threw again upon the sleeper. This time I succeeded in extinguishing the fire and waking Mr. Rochester. "Good God, Miss Eyre, you wicked elf!" he cried. "Are you trying to drown me?" When Mr. Rochester heard my explanation, the blood left his cheeks. "I must go upstairs. Return to bed, Miss Eyre." I tried to leave, but his hand still held my shoulder. "Jane, you saved me from a horrible death." His trembled. "Thank you, my cherished preserver." "You are just a poor plain governess," I chastised myself. "He is too far above you in status and wealth. Do not be so foolish as to imagine yourself his favorite. It can only lead to heartbreak." Over the following weeks I had further reason for caution. Mr. Rochester invited to Thornfield a party of friends of such high-born elegance as I had never seen before. Among them was the beautiful Blanche Ingram. I watched the group with interest, and it soon became evident that she considered herself Mr. Rochester's favorite. Some evenings I took a seat in the corner of the room, watching the assembled party. Although I was often in his presence, I felt excluded from Mr. Rochester's company. I felt this most severely when he and Miss Ingram moved towards the piano to sing a duet. In spite of my efforts, I loved Mr. Rochester. Although rank and wealth would always divide us, something in my brain, heart, and blood joined us together. As long as I breathe and think, I realized with a shock, I must love him. At the piano, Mr. Rochester and Miss Ingram's voices blended beautifully. Unable to bear it, I left the room and stood outside the door, trying to compose myself. Seconds later, Mr. Rochester was beside me. "Jane, you are pale." He looked at me with tender concern. "Are you all right?" I protested that I was tired and must be allowed to retire to bed. He nodded. "Good night, my—" He stopped and bit his lip. Though I watched closely, I saw no such tenderness in his eyes when he looked at Miss Ingram. If he married her, it would be for family and for rank, but not for love. I grieved for him. The following evening, Thornfield received another guest. When I announced Mr. Mason's arrival, Mr. Rochester grew pale. "When will there be an end to all this?" he sighed. However, he soon seemed master both of himself and his new guest. That night my sleep was once again disturbed. Once again I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing. Above me, on the third story, I heard bangs and loud stomping noises. A man's voice cried, "Help! Rochester! For God's sake, help!" Horror shook my limbs as I heard Mr. Rochester run from his room. A loud crash. Silence. Minutes later I was dressed. Mr. Rochester arrived at my door, his eyes darting sparks. "Jane, do you mind the sight of blood?" "No, sir." "Then bring water and a sponge." Fearfully I followed him upstairs to a small room. There lay Mr. Mason, soaked in blood. I began to clean his wounds. From the next room I heard the snarling, scratching noises of a wild beast or fiend. "She bit me," wept Mason. "She sucked my blood. She said she would drain my heart." "I warned you not to visit her alone," frowned Mr. Rochester. Mason failed to master his tears. "I will leave Thornfield in the morning," he whimpered. "Take care of her, Rochester. Treat her tenderly." "I have always done my best, and will continue to do so." Mr. Rochester seemed impatient. Later, as he walked me back to my room, he sighed. "Mason has the power to deprive me of happiness forever." The mystery of the third story was not destined to occupy my thoughts for long. A letter arrived, telling me that my cousin, John Reed, was dead. Mrs. Reed, in her shock, had suffered a stroke. In her delirium, she had called for me. "Promise me that you will stay for only a week," demanded Mr. Rochester. "My aunt received me coldly. I have called you here to ease my mind before I die," she explained. "I have done you a wrong. It is a small matter, but I must relieve myself of the burden. Read this." She handed me a letter. It came 3 years ago. The letter was from a man called John Eyre, in Madeira. Mrs. Reed explained that he was my father's brother, my uncle. In his letter he said that, being childless, he wished to adopt me, his niece, and leave me his considerable wealth. I told him you died at Lowood, Mrs. Reed confessed. I didn't want you to inherit his money. Aunt, you have my full forgiveness. Ask now for God's. Within days she was dead. It was an evening in summer when I returned to Thornfield. The gentle sky promised well for the future. My heart leaped when I saw Mr. Rochester alone in the garden. "Jane," he cried, "how like a ghost you are, appearing from nowhere, in the evening light." "Sir, I have been with my aunt, who is dead." "Ah, so you have come from the other world." His smile spread sunshine over me. "I am glad to return to you," I admitted. "Wherever you are is my only home." Mr. Rochester looked thoughtful. "Jane, before you left, I thought of marrying Miss Ingram." I stepped away from him. "Then I must leave you, sir. I may be poor and plain, but I am your equal in feeling. No, I am your superior, for I would scorn such a marriage." I could not contain my sobs. "Oh, I wish I had never been born." Mr. Rochester seemed agitated. "I learned the truth of my heart during your absence, Jane. I cannot marry Miss Ingram. She has no soul, whereas you have a soul of fire. You are indeed my superior. Jane, I offer you my hand and my heart. Will you pass through life at my side? Will you be my bride?" I stared at him. "Are you happy, Jane?" "I am very happy." "Then this will atone." He smiled. I experienced a period of bliss as we prepared for our wedding. I could play Mr. Rochester's character excellently. Rather than submit to my future husband, I teased him and kept him cross and crusty. On the whole, I think he was excellently entertained. My only cause of unease was the difference in our wealth. I would always be dependent on him, which troubled me. I wondered whether I should contact my uncle in Madeira. A little independence would make me happier. It was a good idea, but I didn't write. Mr. Rochester was disappointed when I showed no interest in the fine clothes and jewels he offered. "I would rather have your confidence than your wealth," I explained. "There must be no secrets between us." "Do not long for poison, Jane," he warned. Perhaps human beings are not meant to enjoy complete happiness in this world. The night before our wedding, I was woken from a restless sleep by a noise in my room. Through the darkness, I saw something standing close to where I had hung my wedding dress. The creature, tall with thick hair, put on my veil. I moved toward my mirror. It was not Grace Poole. Reflected in the mirror, I saw purple, swollen lips and a dark, furrowed brow. Bloodshot eyes rolled within a savage face. I shook with fear. Was it a ghost? A vampire? As the clock struck midnight, the being tore my veil in two and brought her candle close to my face. I must have fainted then, for I remember nothing more. When I explained all this to Mr. Rochester the next morning, he shuddered and held me close. "I will explain it all when we have been married a year and a day," he promised. Our wedding took place in a humble church. During the ceremony, Mr. Rochester looked at me with love and tenderness. My heart swelled with happiness. The clergyman said, "If either of you know any impediment why you may not be joined together in matrimony, confess it now." And I noticed my groom clench his jaw. His flaming eyes betrayed his impatience. The short silence was broken by a voice from the back of the church. "The marriage cannot go on." Mr. Rochester moved slightly. "Proceed," he urged the clergyman. "The marriage cannot proceed," continued the voice. "Mr. Rochester is already married, and his wife is still living." I looked to Mr. Rochester for reassurance. His face was like colorless marble. His hot hand held mine firmly. "He is married to my sister, Bertha Mason." I recognized the voice. I turned to see Richard Mason walking toward us. Mr. Rochester did not deny the accusation. He was indeed married, and our wedding could not proceed. "Return to Thornfield with me," he grimly invited the clergyman and Richard Mason. He held me close. his dark eyes desperate to see understanding and forgiveness in mine. I will show you my wife. Once back at Thornfield, Mr. Rochester led us up the stairs to the 3rd story. Quietly unlocking a door, he smiled a joyless smile. Meet Mrs. Rochester. Inside the darkened room, Grace Poole sat quietly sewing. Take care, sir, she warned. In the shadows at the far end of the room, a dark figure squatted, growling like a wild beast. Seeing her visitors, she gave a fierce cry and rose to her feet. I recognized the swollen purple face I had seen in my mirror the night before. We should leave, whispered Mason. Go to the devil, growled Mr. Rochester. In one violent movement, the lunatic sprang at her husband, sinking her teeth into his cheek. She displayed great strength as he struggled, with the help of Grace Poole, to tie her arms and fasten her to a chair where she continued to shriek. This is my wife. Mr. Rochester smiled grimly to the shocked clergyman. This is the woman I was tricked into marrying 15 years ago. And this, he said as he touched my shoulder, this girl, who stands so quietly at the mouth of hell, is the wife I wish to have. That afternoon Mr. Rochester explained everything to me. 15 years ago, my father tricked me into marrying beautiful, wealthy Bertha Mason of Jamaica. She dazzled me, he admitted, but I knew nothing about her. Oh, I was a fool. My new wife was uncontrolled, the mad child of a lunatic mother. He tried to persuade me to stay as his mistress rather than his wife. I burned inside, longing for the temporary heaven he offered, but I knew that I could not be his on those terms. You condemn me to a wretched life, he cried, grabbing me violently and threatening never to let me go. Our eyes met, and he released me, weeping. What is the point? He cried. It is you, wild, free, virtuous, and pure that I want, not your brittle frame. I am going, sir. He threw himself on the sofa. Oh, Jane, my life, my love! God bless you, my dear master. That night I fled without money or possessions. I put my trust in God. I had nowhere and nobody to run to. I begged a lift in a coach, caring not where it was heading. It was my first experience of begging, but not my last. I slept in the woods. I ate berries, drank from streams, and fought the temptation to return to Thornfield. I looked for work in the villages I passed, but found only suspicion and unfriendliness. My increasingly untidy appearance led people to shun me rather than feed me. After days of friendless wandering, I was weak and desperately hungry. I saw a house with a warm light glowing from the window. I struggled toward it, but reaching it, dared not knock upon the door. I sank, weeping on the doorstep. I can but die. I will await God's will. God does not will that you die on my doorstep, said a man's voice. He carried me inside, and somebody fed me. I must have been very weak, for I could not rise from the bed in which they laid me for 3 days. My host, who introduced himself as Mr. St. John Rivers, was a poor clergyman. He lived in Moore House with his 2 sisters. They offered me their hospitality for as long as I should need it. I told them my name was Jane Elliott. Are you married, Jane Elliott? I wept. They had the sensitivity to ask no further questions. As the weeks passed, I grew uncomfortable relying upon the charity of my new friends, who had little to spare. I found employment as mistress of a small charity school in the village, and moved into my own small home next to the school. I felt busy and useful. I should have been happy. One day, visiting my 3 friends, I found them reading a letter. The ladies were tearful. Our Uncle John is dead, explained St. John. We did not know him well, but we thought perhaps he might leave us a little money. It seems that he has left everything to another unknown relative. I felt their disappointment. The sisters would soon have to find work. Their cozy family home would have to be sold. Over time, I realized that St. John lacked his sister's warmth. He used his eyes to discover other people's thoughts rather than to reveal his own. His hard character took away my liberty of mind. He gained influence over me with his cold determination. With such people I can never find a middle way between absolute submission and determined revolt. I submitted to St. John. One day he visited me with news. I will soon leave to be a missionary, he told me. This did not surprise me. His nature was the kind of rock from which heroes, judges, and statesmen are hewn. I should like you to join me, Jane. This did surprise me. God is calling you, through me, to be his servant. Of course, we must marry first. It would be unthinkable for you to accompany me otherwise. I claim you for God's service, not for my pleasure. No longer able to submit to his will, I burst into volcanic revolt. I scorn your cold idea of marriage, I trembled, and I scorn you for offering it. I will wait for you to change your mind. He frowned, standing to leave. Suddenly he stopped. Something on the corner of a picture I had been sketching earlier caught his eye. Moving quickly, he tore a corner from the paper and left the room. The following morning, a very different, rather flushed, St. John found me. "What is your real name?" he demanded. "If you are Jane Eyre, then you must read this." I reached for the letter he held out to me. "You had scribbled your name on the corner of your sketch. I saw it yesterday," he explained. The letter was from a lawyer in London. He was searching for a person called Jane Eyre, who must be found immediately, for her uncle, Mr. Eyre of Madeira, had died recently, leaving her all his property. "You are rich," smiled St. John. If he expected me to leap for joy, he was disappointed. My uncle had been my only living relative, and now he was dead. I was not ungrateful, however. My heart swelled with the knowledge of my independent wealth. "Perhaps you should ask how much you are worth." "How much?" I obeyed. £20,000. This took my breath. I felt like a person with a small appetite sitting at a feast for 100. A thought suddenly struck me. Something did not quite make sense. "Why did this lawyer contact you?" I asked. St. John was reluctant to answer. "You will find me cold on that point. But I am hot, and fire melts ice," I replied. "Very well. Mr. John Eyre was my uncle, too. You are our mystery relative. We are cousins, Jane." Here was real wealth, wealth to my heart. I was filled with joy. I was no longer alone. I had family, and I could help them. "You must all share this wealth," I exclaimed. "We will be your cousins anyway. You need not make this sacrifice." "It is no sacrifice. We can all be together and independent." Some months later, my 3 cousins and I were all settled comfortably in Moor House. St. John frequently reminded me of my duty to join him in God's work. I no longer saw him as flesh, but as marble. If I married him, this good man would kill me with his coldness. One evening, as I sat quietly with my cousins, I heard a sound which made my heart stand still. Startled, my eyes and ears waited for more. My flesh quivered. "Oh God, what is it?" I gasped. I heard it again. A voice somewhere cried, "Jane! Jane! Jane!" It was a voice I knew and loved. It called wildly, eerily, in pain and with grief. "I am coming," I cried, running into the garden. "Wait for me. Where are you?" The hills answered me with silence. Filled with energy and resolve, I only needed to wait for daybreak. After a journey of 2 days, my coach put me down near to Thornfield. Longing to see that familiar house, I walked quickly, sometimes running. Imagine my shock when, instead of a stately house, I found a blackened ruin. Thornfield had been completely destroyed by fire. I stood and stared in horror. I decided to walk to the village. I needed to know if Mr. Rochester was still alive. If so, where would I find him? I went to the inn, where the innkeeper agreed to answer my questions. "Thornfield was burned down some months ago," he recalled. "The fire broke out in the dead of night." I shuddered. I knew how the fire had started. Was Mr. Rochester home? Yes. Unluckily for him, he helped all of his servants out of the house, then went back in. The servants say he went to rescue a mad wife he kept locked up in there. He followed her onto the roof, where they heard him call, "Bertha!" The next minute, she jumped to her death on the stones below. "What happened to Mr. Rochester?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Is he alive? Yes, but he would be better off dead. He lost one hand and the sight of both eyes. He lives about 30 miles away, at Ferndene, a desolate spot. The following evening I arrived at Ferndene. It was indeed a desolate place. Entering discreetly through a back door, I persuaded an astonished Mrs. Fairfax to allow me to carry Mr. Rochester's supper to him. When I entered his room, I paused, attempting to calm my emotions. The face of the man I loved was desperate and brooding, and his inner fire extinguished. "Your supper, sir," I said gently. Mr. Rochester lifted his face, but his blind eyes saw nothing. "Who was there?" he gasped. "I thought I heard Jane's voice. What sweet madness has seized me? Speak again, Elf." "I am here, sir, and my heart is here too." "Let me touch you." He groped in his personal darkness. I put down the tray, walked to him, held him, and kissed his blind, scarred eyes. "I will never leave you again, sir. I will be your hand and eyes. I will read to you, walk with you, sit with you, and wait on you. But you will be revolted by my wounds." His tears now mixed with mine. "Jane, am I hideous to look at?" "Yes, sir, you always were." "Only 4 days ago, Jane, I gave up all hope of seeing you again. I longed for you with all my soul. In anguish I cried, 'Jane! Jane! Jane!' A chill ran down my spine, but I said nothing. And then, in the darkness, I thought I heard your voice on the wind. I thought I heard you say, 'I am coming. Wait for me.' Reader, I married him. 10 years have now passed, and we are supremely blessed. We suit each other perfectly. In my husband's presence, I am thoroughly alive, and he in mine. The passage of time and the growth of happiness have helped to effect a gradual improvement in my husband's health. He recovered some of the sight in one of his eyes, enough to see our first son. Mr. Rochester's inner fire burns again, and I am as happy as a human can be on this earth."
Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Retold by Anna Kerwan. The characters. Huckleberry Finn. The river doesn't care what his name is or who his friends are. But is the great Mississippi River carrying Huck to freedom or into danger? Pap Finn. The most miserable, low-down drunk in the county. That's the best anyone could say about Huck's daddy. Jim. Jim believes that a man should be able to take care of his family and stand by his friends. Isn't that what freedom is for? Mary Jane Wilkes. Mary Jane has to make big decisions, and the adults around aren't much help. Should she trust a young stranger's heart? The King and the Duke. These two tricksters are never at a loss for words, but can Huck and Jim really trust them? Aunt Sally. Tom's Aunt Sally, Aunt Polly's sister, is generous and trusting. Will she see through Huck and Tom's schemes? Tom Sawyer. Tom thinks Huck is dead. Which of them is more surprised when they meet again? What new adventures await them? Huckleberry Finn. If you read Tom Sawyer, you'll remember Huckleberry Finn. Huck saved the widow Douglas's life, and she gave him a home. Tom and Huck found robbers' gold and became rich. But Huck wasn't used to living in a house and always wearing shoes, doing lessons, praying, and not swearing. When he couldn't stand it anymore, he escaped and felt free and satisfied. He got $1 a day allowance. He didn't want more. Tom found him, though, and talked him back into being civilized. Huck said he'd try respectability again. The widow's sister moved in. Miss Watson had slaves and was forever telling Huck what to do. She warned him about hell until Huck wished he could be there instead of listening to her. The widow's idea of goodness seemed less mean-spirited. Huck reckoned he'd go with the widow's way, if that was possible, him being so ignorant, rotten, and low down. Huck's pap had been missing more than a year. Huck didn't want to see him, 'cause he used to beat Huck. Maybe he drowned, but Huckleberry judged he'd turn up. Tom invented games out of books he read, about genies, robbers, and kings. It made Huck want to learn to read. He thought Tom stretched the truth, but he did it nice as pie. Huck went to school now. He could read, write, and spell some. Was up to 6 times 7 is 35. The widow said he was coming along. She wasn't ashamed of him. But then 3 things happened that Huck knew meant bad luck. He accidentally killed a spider, he spilled salt, and Miss Watson kept him from throwing any over his left shoulder. Then, worst of all, he saw his pap's footprints, with a cross on the heel, so devils wouldn't follow. Huck ran to Judge Thatcher as fast as he could. "Please, take all my money," he begged the judge. "I want to give it to you." "Is something the matter?" the judge asked. "Don't ask me nothing," Huck said. "Then I won't have to tell no lies." "I think I see." Judge Thatcher knew something was up. "You want to sell me control of all your property." He wrote a contract and paid Huck $1 to settle it. He estimated Huck would explain soon enough. Huck went to find Jim, one of Miss Watson's slaves. Jim had children of his own and was always friendly to Huck. Jim knew about fortune-telling and other magic. Huck asked what Pap was up to, now that he was back. Jim told him, "Your old father don't know yet what he's a-goin' to do." Jim saw good luck and bad competing around Huck. Huck walked home to the widow's house. He crept into his room. There sat Pap. Huck was scared of him. "Starchy clothes," growled Pap. "Think you're better than me?" "Maybe I ain't," Huck said. "I'll teach this widow to meddle. You drop that school, putting on airs. Your mother couldn't read or write. None of the family couldn't. I can't. I won't stand it. Say, let me hear you read." Huck read about George Washington. Pap listened a minute, then knocked the book away. "You're rich," said Pap. "I heard about it down river. That's why I come. Give me that money." "I ain't got money. Ask Judge Thatcher." "How about in your pocket?" Pap took Huck's only $1 and went to buy whiskey. The next day Pap went to the judge, but couldn't get the money. Judge Thatcher and the widow tried to get the court to declare one of them Huck's guardian, but a judge who didn't know Pap Finn said courts shouldn't separate families. That pleased Pap. He told Huck he'd whip him black and blue unless he got money. Huck borrowed $3 from Judge Thatcher. Pap took it and got drunk. Huck didn't quit school. Pap thrashed him a few times, and Huck still wouldn't give in. Pap demanded money, got drunk, got jailed, got out, thrashed Huck, and demanded more money. The widow told Pap to leave. Pap said he was Huck's boss, and forced Huck to live with him in an old log cabin. They hunted and fished, and hardly bathed. Huck enjoyed that, but Pap got drunk all the time, and thrashed Huck often. Huck couldn't leave, though. Whenever Pap went to town, he locked Huck in. At night, Pap slept with a key under his head. The widow sent a man to find Huck, but Pap's gun drove him off. Once, Pap got so drunk in town that he forgot his son for 3 days, and Huck was locked in without food. One night, Pap was so drunk he was seeing visions. He almost killed Huck with a shotgun he was aiming at his devils. The next time Pap left, Huck used an old saw to cut an escape route through the logs at the far end of the cabin. Pap never noticed Huck's planned escape route. In the north, snow had melted. The Mississippi River began to rise, just like it did every June. One day, Huck found a stray canoe that had drifted downstream, and he hid it. The next time Pap went into town, Huck crawled out the hole. He loaded the canoe with everything it could carry, then made it seem like robbers had murdered him and thrown him in the river. Before Pap returned, Huck paddled out onto the mile-wide Mississippi, free. Currents carried the canoe south. Huck reached Jackson's Island around dawn and slept. When he woke up, the sun was high. He saw the ferry boat with people he knew on board. They were searching for him. He lay low, and the boat moved on. For 3 days he camped there peacefully, alone. He found ripe strawberries, raspberries, and grapes. Then on the 4th day he found another person's campfire, and a man asleep beside it. It was Jim. Huck was so glad to see him, he called out, "Hello, Jim." Jim stared. "Don't hurt me. I ain't done no harm to ghosts." He'd overheard the talk that Huck had been murdered. Huck proved he was alive. They made breakfast. For days Jim had eaten only berries, and when Huck caught a big catfish, they feasted. Huck told Jim how he'd fooled Pap. Jim said it was so smart Tom Sawyer couldn't have done better. Then Huck asked, "How come you're here?" Jim looked uneasy. "You wouldn't tell on me, would you?" "Blamed if I would." "I run off." "Jim!" "You said you wouldn't tell." "I'll stick to it, honest. People can call me a low-down abolitionist, but I'll never tell." "It is this way. Old missus, she always said she wouldn't sell me down Orleans, but they was a trader around lately, and I hear tell the widow she gone to.
She could get $800 from me. I never waited to hear the rest. I lit out."
Jim had made for the river. He'd hidden on a big raft until close enough to swim to the island. He'd wanted to go all the way to Cairo, Illinois, where the Ohio River joined the muddy Mississippi. That was the way north. Escaped slaves lived free up north. Below Illinois, slave states Kentucky, Tennessee, and Arkansas lined both Mississippi shores. Down the river, south, meant hellish treatment for slaves. Huck and Jim enjoyed camping. All kinds of things came down the swollen river. They caught a raft. A timber house floated toward the island. By night, they paddled out to it on the raft. Cards and bottles lay around. Jim found a body, which he wouldn't let Huck look at. "He's dead. Been shot." They loaded up with useful plunder and got away. When they went through everything, they found $8, fishing line as thick as Huck's finger, and monstrous hooks, which caught them a catfish bigger than Jim, a tasty fry. Was anyone still searching for them? Huck disguised himself as a girl and went to the shore to ask around. A lady invited her in. Huck learned some folks thought Pap murdered him. They had talked about lynching Pap until Jim had disappeared. Now some thought Jim had killed Huck. Many wanted the reward for catching him. Huck's disguise was better than his acting. The lady guessed he wasn't really a girl. She was kind, but Huck left quickly. Bounty hunters, she said, were searching Jackson's Island that night. Huck and Jim loaded the raft and pushed off. They'd tie up and sleep by daylight, so nobody'd see Jim. They drifted 8 hours a night. The current pushed them along at around 4 miles an hour. They fished and they swam to keep awake. It was solemn, drifting along like that. Their talk was quiet, and their laughter just low chuckles. Sliding down river that way, they passed the midnight sparkle of St. Louis. The 5th night after that, in a bad storm, they came upon a wrecked steamboat. Huck wanted to go aboard. "Do you reckon Tom would pass this up?" he reasoned with Jim. They climbed aboard, and then they saw a light. A voice wailed, "Please, I won't tell." "You always want more than your share," another said. "You're the meanest town in this county." Huck spied one man tied up, and 2 gunmen standing over him. He heard the 2 decide to leave the other to sink with the wreck. "Quick, Jim," Huck whispered. "Tie their boat to our raft." "Raft?" Jim groaned. "Ain't no raft no mo'. Done broke loose and gone." The robbers had ransacked the steamboat and loaded their skiff. In seconds, Huck and Jim were in that skiff. They cut the rope, grabbed the oars, and they were off. They caught up with their raft. Huck worried about the shipwrecked men. The widow believed in pitying sinners. He and Jim dumped the plunder onto their raft, and Huck jumped back in the skiff. He found help to rescue them, but it was too late. The wreck swirled downriver, too deep in the water for survivors. Huck got back to Jim and the raft. Nowhere else was as safe and peaceful. The haul from the wreck was great: boots, blankets, and books. Huck read to Jim about kings like Louis XVI. Huck said that royalty were spoiled. He explained how they thought. Everything belonged to them, and they just sat around, except during wars. Jim thought that kings sure did behave very foolishly. They figured they were 3 nights away from Cairo. They'd sell the raft and buy steamboat passage up the Ohio, out of trouble. But the 2nd night, fog came in. They couldn't run in that. Huck, in the canoe, towed the raft ashore to tie up, but the current tore the raft and Jim away. The fog was so thick now that Huck couldn't see anything. Huck was sick afraid. He didn't dare paddle for fear of running into the bank. He let the river carry him. Ahead, he heard a faint whoop. Jim! They signaled that way a while, then no more whoops. Had Jim drowned? Then a faraway call. They were on opposite sides of an island. Finally, Huck found the raft again. Jim was exhausted and asleep. Huck was so relieved he had to joke about it, or else he would feel uncomfortable. He'd tease Jim as Tom often did. He stretched his arms and pretended to just be waking up. His stretching woke Jim, who was so relieved he hugged him. But Huck acted as if the fog and losing one another had all been Jim's dream, and ridiculed Jim's joy at their reunion. Jim finally figured out what Huck was doing. His dignity was offended, and his feelings were hurt. Then Huck was ashamed. He apologized for his trick. He hadn't known Jim would feel that way. They talked about Cairo. Jim was excited to be so close to freedom. Huck hadn't considered what he'd feel. Miss Watson would call it stealing to help her slave escape. Huck felt low down, stealing from someone who tried to help him. His conscience confused him.
Jim said he'd go up north, save money, and buy his wife. Then they'd work to buy their children. If they couldn't buy them, they'd steal them. Freedom was giving Jim ideas. Huck worried. He couldn't decide whether it was right or wrong to help a slave. They saw a light. Was it Cairo? Huck paddled off to ask. Maybe he would turn Jim in. Suddenly, armed men in a skiff rowed up to the raft and asked Huck some questions. They were bounty hunters who wanted to search Huck's raft. "I wish you would," Huck said. "My folks are on the raft deathly ill. Please help." The men were afraid of catching smallpox, so each of them gave Huck a $20 gold piece to help out the family and left very quickly. Huck's lie kept Jim safe, but soon they realized they'd missed Cairo in the fog. Now they'd have to sell the raft and canoe back upstream. Then things got worse. They saw a steamboat heading straight at them. Jim and Huck dived overboard as the steamboat smashed through the raft. Huck dived deep, knowing a deadly 30-foot wheel had to go over him. He stayed under about a minute and a half, then bounced up. He called Jim over and over, but there was no answer. Huck swam ashore. For a few days, Huck was looked after by a family called the Grangerfords, who were involved in a murderous feud. One day Huck found himself in the midst of a gunfight and escaped back to the river, where he found the Grangerford slaves had helped Jim repair the raft and gather supplies. "I's mighty glad to get you back again. Thought you'd been shot. Don't lose no time, Jim. Shove off for the big water." There was no home like a raft. More days and nights passed, quiet and lovely. The river ran 1.5 miles wide. They slept days, traveled nights, dangled their legs in the water, and talked. One morning Huck found a canoe and took it ashore to pick berries. Suddenly 2 men came running up the path, chased by other men with dogs. The 2 men begged for help, so Huck took them to the raft. Huck discovered the 2 men were in trouble for selling toothpaste that dissolved teeth. The younger man said he'd been a printer, an actor, a hypnotist, and a singing geography teacher. The old bald one said he usually cured cancer or paralysis or told fortunes. The younger one sighed and said he'd lost his fortune. He was really the exiled Duke of Bridgewater and would like to be called Your Grace. He asked Jim to wait on him. After a while, the older one said, "I too fell on hard times. I am the poor Louis XVII, son of Marie Antoinette. Trouble has brung these gray hairs and premature balditude." He too thought he'd feel better if they served him. Huck figured they weren't real royalty like in books. He thought it would keep the peace, though, letting them have their way. They asked, was Jim a runaway? Huck told them Jim was his family's slave he'd inherited. He said they were traveling at night, so nobody'd mistake Jim for a runaway. That night, rain came. The Duke and King took over the shelter and bedding, while Huck and Jim kept watch on deck. Jim watched extra hours when Huck got sleepy. The next day, the 2 rogues told Huck their plan to make some money. From his bag, the Duke produced some flyers. He said to the King, "We'll rent a hall and do the sword fight from Richard III and the balcony scene from Romeo and Juliet. I'll teach you Shakespeare." After their rehearsals, which made mincemeat of Shakespeare, they went ashore while Jim stayed on the raft. The little town was deserted, and everyone had gone to a revival. The Duke found an empty printing shop and said he'd stay there while the King and Huck went to the camp meeting to fleece the faithful. The King could really preach. He told the people he used to be a pirate, but was saved and was now a missionary. He took up a collection. The Duke, meanwhile, used the print shop as if he owned it. By the time they got back to the river, the pair had made $97.25. The Duke had posters for their show and had made an advertisement for a runaway slave with a reward offered. It described Jim. The Duke said they could travel by daylight now. If anyone came near, they'd tie Jim and say they were after the $200 bounty. They all thought that would work. The next few days, the royalty rehearsed. They jumped around, whacked each other with wooden swords, and shouted speeches. One morning in Arkansas, they hid the raft and went to find a place to perform. Luckily, a circus was in Brickville, and people were already arriving for the show. The Duke rented the courthouse and hung posters. A lot of drinking was going on, and things got rowdy. Only a few people came to see Shakespeare. The next morning, the Duke said what the people wanted was low comedy. He painted a sign for a play called The Royal Nonsuch. It said, "Ladies and children not admitted." That night the audience was packed with men expecting something special. The curtain went up. The King pranced out on all fours, naked and painted all colors. Everyone roared with laughter. 2 minutes later the curtain came down. The Duke sauntered out and said the tragedy would be performed for 2 more nights, so they should tell their friends. Everyone who'd paid thought he'd been cheated. The next night, after selling the last ticket, the Duke pulled Huck out the back door. These customers weren't newcomers. They were last night's audience, who had returned with rotten vegetables and eggs to pelt the old frauds. Once they were safe and heading downriver, they laughed. They'd taken that town for $465. That night, Jim said, "They's reg'lar rapscallions, Huck." Kings is kings, Huck figured. They're an ornery lot. It's how they're raised. You gotta make allowances. Huck slept while Jim stood watch. When Huck awoke at daybreak, Jim was mourning to himself. Huck knew he missed his wife and children. He expected never to see them again. Huck saw that Jim loved them deeply, and it troubled him. That day they heard news. A man called Mr. Peter Wilkes had just died, leaving his estate to 3 nieces and his 2 brothers, who were expected to arrive soon from England. This interested the king, and he listened closely for details. When he and the Duke talked it over, they decided to leave Jim on the raft and pose as the Wilkes brothers from England, coming to help and grieve with their nieces, Mary Jane, Susan, and Joanna. The king's accent was terrible. The Duke supposedly couldn't hear or speak. Huck was their valet. Most people in town hadn't met any foreigners. The Wilkes girls didn't know their English uncles, but were ready to love them dutifully. A friend, the doctor, advised caution, but they welcomed the impostor uncles who leaned over the coffin, weeping piteously. Peter Wilkes' will left them all something: houses, a tannery, some slaves, and $6,000. Mary Jane invited them to stay at the house. By nightfall, the royal uncles had their hands on the money. The king hid the $6,000 in his mattress, but he wasn't done scheming. Huck wanted to warn Mary Jane, but if he exposed the thieves, what would happen to him and to Jim? The next morning, the girls asked about England. Huck got everything wrong. Mary Jane wouldn't let her sisters doubt his word, though. Huck appreciated her kindness. He couldn't let these girls be robbed. Uncle Harvey wanted to sell everything after the funeral and told the nieces they'd live with him in England. Huck saw he had to rescue that money from the mattress. He would swipe it, hide it, and when he and Jim got away, he'd write Mary Jane and tell where it was. It wasn't hard to grab the money bag, but Huck had to hide it well. Late that night, he crept downstairs, but the front door was locked. Someone was coming. He ducked into the parlor, where the corpse lay until burial. Hearing steps approaching closer, Huck thrust the money bag deep into the coffin and hid behind the door. Mary Jane came in to weep and pray. Huck didn't want to leave the money there, but he had to. He got back upstairs unseen, but worried. The funeral was next day, and the money was buried along with Uncle Peter. The king arranged to auction off the Wilkes property that very week. Before the girls realized what was happening, the slaves they knew and loved had been sold down the river, with mothers and children separated. Mary Jane and her sisters were shocked and miserable. The king and Duke learned the money bag was gone. They grilled Huck. Had he been in there? Huck said he'd seen slaves tiptoe out, the same ones who'd now been sold. That fixed the old humbugs. Later, though, he came upon Mary Jane, crying. She was so beautiful and kind that Huck couldn't bear it. He knew once the deception of the so-called uncles was revealed, everything they had sold would be recovered. He had to comfort her. "Your slaves will be back in together, I know it." Mary Jane hugged him. "Say it again," she begged. Huck reckoned in a tight place, telling the truth was risky. He lacked experience at it, but it had to be done. "I gotta tell the truth," he explained. "Brace up, it's bad. These uncles are frauds." He told her everything. Her eyes blazed. Huck promised he could stop them, but he had to do it his way, to protect someone else. She said she'd do whatever he needed. He told her to stay away all day because her face would show she knew the truth. That night, she could get the scoundrels jailed. If he got caught with them, she'd vouch for him. If he was gone, she could inquire at Brickville about the Royal Nonsuch for more proof they were fakes. He couldn't bring himself to tell her where the money was. He was glad he had enough schooling to write an explanation that Mary Jane could read later. Mary Jane thanked him fervently, took his hand, and said she'd pray for him. Huck thought if she knew him better, she'd take on a job more her size. If he thought it would do any good, he'd have prayed for her. She was so sweet. The houses were auctioned that afternoon. During the sale, a steamboat landed, bringing Peter Wilkes' friends, his doctor, his lawyer, and a man who declared he'd seen the king and Huck in town before they claimed they'd arrived. Could they prove their identity? The king said their baggage and identification hadn't arrived yet. Uncle Harvey's accent didn't convince those few who'd actually been to England, and the newcomers laughed at the idea of Huck being English. "Reckon you ain't used to lying," the lawyer told him. "You do it pretty badly." Then the lawyer tried a trick. He asked the king to describe Peter's tattoo. "A thin blue arrow," the king announced, "and hard to see." The undertaker hadn't noticed any tattoo. The crowd made their feelings known. "They're frauds! Ride 'em on a rail!" "Gentlemen," the lawyer said, "there's one way to know. Dig up the coffin." The crowd made it clear that if no tattoo existed, they'd lynch them, Huck included. They surged toward the graveyard. It was the worst danger Huck had ever been in. A storm was coming on, and it was getting dark. If only the man guarding him would get distracted, it'd be a good time to leave. Lit by flickering lightning, they dug up the coffin and lifted the lid. Everyone crowded forward. Somebody shouted, "Here's the bag of gold!" Huck's captor dropped his grip in the excitement. Huck ran away, back through the empty town. A light burned in Mary Jane's window. His heart swelled, but he had to get to the raft. When he reached the river, he found a canoe and started paddling full steam. He fell onto the raft alongside Jim, exhausted. "Set her loose, Jim. Glory be, we're rid of them." They took off, but in the next lightning flash, they saw a skiff following. The royalty! The king grabbed Huck, shook him, and said, "Tired of our company?" "No, your majesty," Huck said. "When they found the gold, the man holding me let go, so I ran." "Let go the boy," the duke said. "Did you inquire around for him when you got loose?" The two of them suspected each other of hiding the gold, intending to come back alone to retrieve it. They bickered until the duke started choking the king, who had to give in. Then they started scheming again. Jim and Huck were worried. What was next? Robbery? Counterfeiting? They were far south now. The frauds reckoned they were out of danger, but none of the angles they'd played before made money. One morning the king went ashore to see if anyone there had heard of the royal nonsuch. By the time the duke and Huck found him, he was drunk. While the two royals argued, Huck slipped away, back to Jim and the raft. But Jim was gone. Huck saw a boy nearby and asked if he'd seen anyone by Jim's description. "Yes," the boy said. "He's a runaway. They've got him at Phelps' sawmill. $200 reward. Old fellow who nailed him had to go upriver and couldn't wait to collect, so he sold his rights for $40. Huck asked what the old fellow had looked like. It was the king. After all that journey, everything Jim and Huck had done for those scoundrels, they did that to Jim, made him a slave again for life for $40. Huck felt low. Maybe Providence was slapping him for his wickedness. Huck tried to promise heaven he'd write to Miss Watson so she could claim her legal rights to Jim, but he couldn't do it. He found out that you can't pray a lie. He thought about the trip down river with Jim. He couldn't harden his heart. He remembered every time Jim stood watch for him, and how glad Jim was when he got back safe after they got separated. Jim hugged him and called him honey the way he did his own children. After the lie to the bounty hunters, Jim had called Huck his best friend, his only friend. Huck knew he had to decide whose side to be on. He studied a minute, then said to himself, "All right then, I'll go to hell." He'd steal Jim out of slavery again. He hid the raft, put on his best clothes, then paddled the canoe to Phelps' sawmill where Jim was being held. He hid the canoe and headed for the house. Hounds in the yard barked. Then a woman appeared. "It's you at last. Children," she called, hugging Huck and drawing him indoors. "It's your cousin Tom," she told the children. Then to Huck, "Uncle Silas went to fetch you. Wasn't he at the landing?" "No, ma'am." "Not ma'am. Call me Aunt Sally," she chided. "How's Sis? How's everybody?" Huck was mighty confused. Just in time, Aunt Sally grabbed him and hid him behind the bed. "Here he comes. We'll play a joke." Huck was in a sweat. "Hasn't he come?" Aunt Sally asked the old gentleman when he came in. "Goodness, where can he be?" She carried on like that, then said, "Why, look yonder." When her husband peered out the window, Aunt Sally produced Huck, her surprise. "Who's that?" Uncle Silas cried. "It's Tom Sawyer," she announced, pleased as pie. Huck almost collapsed with surprise and relief. He felt reborn. He could be Tom Sawyer. They asked about Sid, Mary, and Aunt Polly. Being Tom was easy and comfortable, until he heard a steamboat coming down river. What if Tom arrived and shouted Huck's name? Huck said he had to go get his baggage, and took the horse and wagon. Halfway to town, here came a wagon carrying Tom. Tom gasped and said, "A ghost! I ain't ever done you no harm. Why'd you want to come back to haunt me?" "I ain't come back," Huck said. "I ain't been gone." "Weren't you murdered?" "No, I faked it. You come feel of me if you don't believe me." Tom was mighty glad. Huck told him the fix was in, and asked what Tom reckoned they'd better do. Tom devised a plan. Huck would take Tom's trunk back as his baggage. Tom would come a bit later. At first, Huck shouldn't let on he knew him. Then Huck told him there was another problem. Miss Watson's Jim was the Phelps captive, and Huck was trying to steal him out of slavery. But Jim is... Tom stopped and thought. Huck felt low down. I know it's dirty business, he told Tom, but I'm a-going to free him, and I want you to keep quiet. I'll help you, said Tom. Huck was astonished, but Tom started planning. He'd show up at the Phelps place at dinner time, pretending he was his half-brother, Sid. The plan worked. Over dinner, Huck and Tom listened for news of Jim. Finally, the little boys asked to go to the show. Uncle Silas said there wouldn't be one. The runaway they'd captured had told them about that scandalous show. Nobody was going. Huck and Tom retired early, then climbed out the window, intending to warn the Duke and King they'd been found out. In town, they met a noisy rush of people with torches. The crowd had the Duke and the King tarred and feathered. They were riding them out of town on a sharp split rail. It was so cruel, Huck felt sorry. He thought he'd never feel any hardness toward the old fools again. They returned to the sawmill. I bet I know where Jim is, said Tom. That hut. They take food back there and unlock it. It's Jim. What brains Tom had, Huck thought. He tried to plan how to free Jim, but he knew Tom would invent something better. Still, he didn't understand why a respectable character like Tom would stoop to stealing a slave. Yet Tom was absolutely for it. The next day they went down to the hut. There was one window. Simple, Huck said. Too simple, Tom decided. We could saw him out like I done before I was murdered, Huck suggested. That's good. Mysterious, troublesome, good. But we can do more. Ain't no hurry. They pried open the lean-to behind the hut. There was no door into Jim, but there were shovels and a dirt floor. They could dig Jim out. It would take longer than sawing or the window, but Tom explained there was more honor in accomplishing tasks despite dangerous difficulties. Tom talked to the black field hand bringing Jim's food. He let them visit Jim, who was overjoyed. Don't let on you know us, Tom whispered. If you hear digging, it's us. We're setting you free. Jim only had time to clasp Tom's hand before they had to go. Tom invented a surefire, complicated escape. He thought of everything. Jim was chained by one leg to his bed. Lifting the bed would free him if he carried the chain, but Tom thought sawing the bed's leg would be better. Instead of lanterns, they'd gather rotten foxfire bark for light. Tom could complicate anything until it was elegant. Tom and Huck helped Jim scratch messages here and there. They stole sheets to make a rag rope and got it to him baked inside a pie. They were all proud of that. Huck was getting nervous. Aunt Sally had sent news to Louisiana about Jim. Soon Miss Watson and the widow Douglas would know where he was. But Tom said they weren't finished making it a first-class escape. They did everything the best books recommended. Jim appreciated their resolve to do it right. Finally, after about 3 weeks, they were ready for the last detail. Tom said there had to be anonymous warning. He wrote, "Beware, trouble brewing. Cutthroat gang will steal your runaway tonight." Huck slipped it under the Phelps door. He didn't realize the reaction it'd get. After dinner, Aunt Sally knew Huck was up to something. She sent him into the parlor to wait for her. There were 15 farmers in there with guns. They meant to stop the gang from stealing Jim. Huck was anxious to get away and warn Tom. As soon as Aunt Sally sent him upstairs, he climbed out and ran for the hut. Tom was thrilled. They heard the men coming as they squeezed out through the lean-to. They got to the fence, and Jim and Huck got over, but Tom's britches caught. Bang, bang! Bullets whizzed past. "After 'em! Turn loose the dogs!" someone called. The dogs knew them, though, and ran past. The escapees got to the waterside where Huck had left the canoe. They headed for the island, and at last fell onto the raft. "Now, Jim, you're a free man again," said Huck. "I bet you won't ever be a slave no more." "It is planned beautiful, and it is done beautiful," Jim rejoiced. They were all glad, especially Tom, because he'd been shot in the leg. He was bleeding. Huck and Jim consulted. "If 'twas him being set free and someone got shot, would Tom Sawyer say, 'Never mind 'bout a doctor'?" Jim said. "Well, then I don't budge till the doctor look at that leg." Tom raised a fuss, but Huck went. He told the doctor his brother got hurt hunting. They'd rather their folks didn't know. The doctor agreed to go, but he didn't trust the canoe to carry two. Huck told him where to find Tom, then started back to the Phelps house. He met Uncle Silas and told him he and Sid had followed the men last night but got separated. He said Sid had just gone down to town for news of the gang. The next morning the doctor arrived with men carrying a sick, feverish Tom. They had Jim, too. Some folks talked of hanging him to set an example. Others said he was valuable because his owner would pay for him. The doctor came out and said, "Treat him well. He could have run, but he saved that boy instead." They stopped cussing Jim, but they did lock him up. It was another day before Tom woke in his right mind. "Where's the raft? Where's Jim? Did you tell Auntie the story, how we set him free?" Aunt Sally thought he was raving, but Tom decided to tell her the full story of Jim's escape. "So it was you, little rapscallion," she scolded. "No more meddling with that runaway." Tom rose up in bed. "Turn him loose. He ain't no slave. Miss Watson died 2 months ago. She was ashamed she thought of selling him, so she set him free in her will." Then Tom turned to the door, and his eyes widened. "Aunt Polly?" Tom's Aunt Polly was standing right there. "Didn't you get my letter?" she asked, as Aunt Sally hugged her. "You wrote me about Sid, but Sid is at home. What are you doing here, Huckleberry Finn?" So another deception was uncovered. Aunt Polly confirmed what Tom had said about Miss Watson's will. Tom had plotted to free Jim, knowing he'd never be a slave again. The opportunity had been just too good to miss. Huck brought Jim up to Tom's room to talk. When the adults heard how he'd helped the doctor, everyone made a fuss over Jim. Tom suggested to Huck that they and Jim go out west among the Indians. Huck said it would suit him, but he couldn't afford to buy an outfit. He reckoned by now Pap had got his money from Judge Thatcher and drunk it up. "No, he ain't," Tom said. "Money's all there." "Yo, Pap ain't a-comin' back no more," said Jim. "Remember that house was floatin' and they was a dead man? That was him." So Huck thought maybe he'd head out for Indian territory. Aunt Sally was starting to talk about adopting and civilizing him. He couldn't stand for that. He'd been there before.
Building Dams by Rebecca Steffoff. Chapter 1. Water Worries. People and beasts